Our topic, as you have said, my brother, is Africa-China relations, and I hope somewhere in there is the subtitle, The African Response. This is a complicated topic. It has cultural, spiritual, economic, political, and other aspects to it. It is something which at the moment there's a lot of heat being generated, and frequently when you have heat, you don't get the corresponding light, or the heat just in fact overwhelms the light. So we need to be careful. In respect of all of those matters, the cultural, the political, the economic, and so on, we Africans have interest, as do every other people in the world. And the thing about interest is that you have to be conscious, politically, ideologically, culturally, what they are. And you also have, as far as possible, to have the capacity, having grasped what those interests are in all of those spheres, to then be able to defend those interests, or in even more than just defend, to advance. Because if you spend all your time defending, you're probably in some way in retreat, objectively. So not just defending, but advancing your interests matter. And sadly, Africa has not been at the level of consciousness or at the level of practicality really able frequently even to recognize its interests, let alone to defend them. And so right now, after 500 years of European power impacting upon us, after a considerably longer period than that of Arab Islam impacting upon us, we have ended up at the bottom of the international heap. That needs to be explained. And the fact that if you are at the bottom, almost everybody else is notionally or actually in some way either sitting or resting on you, in some way holding you down. It matters that those people who are in whatever the justification, whatever the basis, see themselves, feel themselves, know themselves to be above you in an international, cultural, political, economic, and so on order of things. They're going to be trying as far as possible to exploit your interest in their interest. And that is the situation in which we Africans find ourselves. Now, it's important that it has not always been so. That my brother, one of my brothers, Robin Walker, has a book called When We Ruled. And I think it's important that we say it's actually when we ruled ourselves, because although there have been times in history when we have definitely been culturally, economically, and in other respects, the most important people in the world, there was never a time when we ruled the world in the known world in the way that Rome ruled it, or Britain in recent times, or that in a way America, with apologies to China, is now ruling it. So all of that matters. And the heat that's now being generated springs from the fact that Africans, not incorrectly, see Chinese, not so much China, not the government of China who could do something about these matters, but Chinese people taking liberties with Africans. And that has correctly riled us, though it is not sufficient to be riled. It's important to not waste energy on being riled impotently, but understanding why you have been riled, where the power of others to rile, and worse than that, to exploit and dominate us Africans come from, and equally or even more importantly, how we can arrive at a state of affairs in which those who are clearly taking liberties with us are stopped from doing so, and we move further up the international pecking order. Not that we want to rule anybody else, but we don't at the moment have the capacity to rule ourselves. And in consequence of that, we are being very exploitatively ruled, even though it looks as if we have independence and that kind of thing, which we may or may not come back to in this discussion. Now, the power of the white world, some people call it capitalism, imperialism. A close associate of mine calls their power white terrorism, and there is much logic and correctness in that. But in the context in which, for the last 500 or so years, European terrorist power has ruled and terrorized and done genocide to many peoples, including us, not in the sense of eliminating us as a people, but eliminating great sections of us during the Atlantic enslavement and during genocides in Africa. And many of them were actually bigger than the ones that we know about. So that's where international power places us at the moment. And it matters that international power placed others low down in the pecking order also a little while ago, so that anybody who's, for example, Native American or original native peoples of the Americas will know that several gigantic cultures and civilizations of theirs were simply wiped out by the Europeans. And so let us not tell that story now. What matters as part of the story that we're seeking to tell and understand, as part of the struggle that we have to take on and win, is that at the beginning of the 20th century, a little over 100 years ago, the Chinese, who are now riling us by taking liberties with us on the continent of Africa, and sometimes in the continent of Africa itself, where they are allowed to do that. I'm going to come back to that. At the beginning of the 20th century, China was as much, indeed perhaps more, an object of international ridicule than Africa is now. And the Chinese recognized their interest, recognized that they had to fight to restore their capacity to control their own existence, to eliminate external, at least, exploitation, and set about doing that. And so when you look at 20th century Chinese history, it also looks like 20th century African history, where we also seem to recognize that we need to do something about changing where we were in the world. And what we did was to take on colonialism. And I'm going to come back to the extent to which we didn't win the battle against colonialism, even though we appeared to do so. So the Chinese conducted a battle not just against colonialism. China was certainly colonized, and Hong Kong, for example, everybody knows, saw maybe with respect to them, the idiocy of Chinese young people in Hong Kong not all that many months ago, when they were behaving very badly over a circumstance in which they can't change, which is they've imbibed Western capitalist ideas, and they don't too like the fact that the ruling society is communist China. Now, to mention communist China is key to understanding the difference between our African place and state and status in the world, as opposed to that of China and Chinese in the world today. So there was an anti-colonial struggle in Africa, and many of the Africans who conducted those struggles also said that they were engaged in anti-imperialist struggle. Kwame Nkrumah particularly made the point that the enemy was not just colonialism, but also imperialism. So we Africans fought, and we mustn't say that we had no victories to our credit. What we have to do is recognize the limitations of the victory. You can win victories and the enemy is still there, so that you haven't defeated them totally, and they have the capacity to come back and do you great harm. So bearing all of that in mind, the Chinese, faced with exactly the same type of situation, with Western power and the allies of Western power impinging on them very directly inside of China. That part of their history involved the British, for example, producing opium in India and taking it to China and forcing Chinese into the consumption of opium. So there were some things called opium wars a little bit earlier in Chinese history. So in the 20th century, all of that heritage of oppression, of denigration, which the West in the late 19th and early 20th century was able to impose, the Chinese decided that they had to fight against. And 20th century Chinese history is a history of certain forces in Chinese society lining up against each other with different ideological perspectives. One of the main forces was in fact pro-Western, even though they didn't argue it in those terms. Objectively they were. And against that you had the forces that came to be led by the late Chairman Mao, who not only were anti-colonial but emphatically anti-imperialist, wanted to move China completely from under the domination of capitalism, imperialism, of, if you like, the Western terrorists. And in order to do that, they had to fight a civil war in which they engaged with and defeated the internal allies of imperialism, of white supremacy, which would have remained in place in China, even though it might not have looked so, in exactly the way that India was left under the control of those forces. We won't go into that. On another day, we'll probably talk about India. So the Chinese, by the pro-people, anti-imperialist, anti-external exploitation, anti-exploitation of the people, run by internal allies of external forces, the Chinese defeated those forces and then set about making China free of those imperialist, racist encumbrances into the world power that it now is. And that is what the world faces. Us Africans face it, and the white supremacists also face it. You can hear the resentment in Trump. You can read it in the books that they publish. They are worried about China and resentful of China because over the last 500 years, they made themselves used to and made themselves think that something that they were used to, namely appearing to be at the top of the human tree, appearing to be the best that evolution produced, or the best that even God produced, that somehow they are not supposed to be rivaled by anybody. And in a way, that's what the battle in the Second World War in Asia was about. The Japanese, a little bit earlier than the Chinese, were seeking to assert, but doing it in a very different way from China, a sphere of Asian influence in Asia. Unfortunately, it would have been Japanese Asians, and they've dominated wholly of other people, and so on. And the Chinese appears to me not to be doing that. But the long and the short of this is that the civil war in China continued for certainly from the 1920s right through to the 1940s. And towards the end of the 1940s, the forces inside of China and the power of imperialism inside of China were totally defeated, and those who represented them were forced out of mainland China, and they're often someplace called Taiwan or somewhere, which long after China became what the West calls communist China, the West was still pretending that China was really the pro-Western government on Taiwan. We've gone past that now, even though Trump and the Americans are busy arming that part of China in order to make it difficult for China to complete the physical takeover of the control of its territory in the way that the British had to move out of the way in the 90s and give Hong Kong back to China. So the Chinese, having done the right things inside of their history, that is to say, not just defeated the political form of white power, but defeated the economic form of white power internally and drive it out to China, and also defeated the allies of white power, terrorism in China. China is a different place from Africa because of that. Now, how have we Africans failed? We appeared to be engaged in the same kind of battle against the same kind of forces. I mentioned Kwame Nkrumah because not everybody was like him, and not everybody saw the vital importance of not just perceiving and taking on those who ruled our countries, the global Africa, if you will, in their political aspect, but knowing that their this whole socio-economic system was also the enemy, and that if after you won your political alleged freedom, flag independence, some people called it, after you won that, somehow you were free. We ended up, therefore, in a state of affairs in which Garvey had said that Africa needed to be one country. It's now 50 odd, certainly. Nkrumah had said that Africa had to be one country, one unitary state. And so effective was white ideological rule in Africa that the white terrorists could assemble a majority of African leaders, men who were passing themselves off as liberation fighters, some of them, men who were passing themselves off as interested in the African personality, in all of this whole heap of ideological stuff was spouted by them. Those people lined up against Kwame Nkrumah. Sadly, for complicated reasons we can't go into today, Nkrumah himself ended up voting for it. But what they did in 1963, when the Organization of African Unity was founded, what they did was to agree to leave in place the model of Africa that the white terrorists had devised in 1884-85 in the Congress of Berlin. That Africa would have all of those borders, which were European borders, not African borders, that Africa would have no central authority, that Africa would have no central military power, that Africa, in other words, would be unable to defend itself because the balkanization of the continent, which had been established in the context of the various European powers cutting it up and benefiting from the little pieces, sometimes quite big pieces, certainly always rich pieces, that they held on to. So 1963, which looks like a triumph for African nationalism, is in fact an expression of anti-African forces being given a form of state power, embedded in the African Union as the overall, the Organization of African Unity, later, with no change, became the African Union. That entity, together with these 50-odd little states. Now, let me get more directly to the Africa-China issue, which is really what I've been talking about, because the capacity of Chinese, as Chinese in China or Chinese in Africa, to take liberties with us Africans, both in Africa and in China, is a function of the fact that our revolution for self-liberation, self-empowerment, to give ourselves the capacity to demand the stop of the cessation of exploitation and compensation for the exploitation, it having been ended by our revolutionary efforts. Now, given that Africa failed to do that, unlike China, unlike Cuba, we are cultivating African impotence, and a people who are cultivating their own impotence cannot be surprised if others who have liberated and empowered themselves do so. What I have either done so off our backs a longer time ago, or are doing it or seeking to do it now, whatever methods they use. So we Africans, the current fuss, let me call it no higher than that, the current excitement, the current heat around African mistreatment of China is something to do with the fact, and it appears to be a fact, that the Chinese, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 virus, are taking liberties with Chinese inside of China. Everybody knows that whether the COVID-19 virus is man-made or natural, came from some animals in some way inside of China, really doesn't matter. What matters is that the Chinese, whether it started there or not, the first outbreak of it definitely took place there, and they took stern and sensible measures to suppress it in the main locality in which it broke out. So, and because since having suppressed it internally, almost all of the cases, the new cases of the virus that they are now discovering in China, are thought and said by them to have been brought there by people arriving from outside of China, Chinese arriving from outside of China, and a few Africans, less than 20, arriving from outside of China into China. The Chinese, who are just as capable of acting stupidly, just as maybe hateful and feel superior to foreigners as everybody else might do, and as almost everybody else does at one time or another, have taken it upon themselves to over-identify and over-blame the tiny minority of Africans who have come into the country. Incidentally, very few of the very small number of Africans we're talking about have actually tested positive for the coronavirus. But the Chinese have been very heavy-handed about testing very aggressively and tracing and testing very aggressively. People have complained that they've been put out of their residences, and no doubt that has happened. People have complained that Chinese policemen who are heavy-handed are telling them to get off the street and go home, and they no home for them to go to because they have been put out of their homes. So terrible things are happening to a small number of Africans in China as we speak. And there is no denying that. And it is right that fellow Africans raise the issue with China. What we mustn't do is raise it hysterically, because to be hysterical about this and not to be as hysterical about what other people's Europeans, Euro-Americans, Europeans in Germany and Italy and France and the United Kingdom and the United States of America are doing day in, day out to Africans. Look at the figures for how many Africans are being beaten up and killed in the United States of America as we speak daily. Look at the figures for police deaths in custody, and the large proportion of those deaths in custody where Africans like you and me have been the victims. And no African government, not the OAU and not the AU, as far as I know, raised a finger or is now raising a finger in relation to those matters. So there is a certain selectivity, and obviously where we have the capacity to enforce proper behavior, we should do so. And since we have some relative power over the Chinese, given quite an economic and political relationship between us and them, it follows that we should do that. But I've seen some stuff which is hysterical. And the reason why we Africans need to avoid hysteria around this matter is that worse things than what the Chinese are doing to Africans, which they shouldn't be doing and which we should protest about vigorously, are happening to Africans in the UK now, in Germany now, in France now, in Italy now, in the United States of America now, and no continental Africans are raising a finger about that. It gets worse because we have an ongoing history of very bad behavior by Africans in the southern part of the continent towards other Africans from not very far afield. The South African Africans are behaving badly as we speak towards Zimbabweans, and they're behaving murderously badly towards Africans from other part of the continent, further afield, right? So we, in expressing our anger and indignation, it matters that we do not get hysterical about one issue or one enemy that's acting where this matter is concerned in unacceptable and dreadful ways. Now, there may be, indeed there is, a bigger case to be made against the Chinese, that the people who are at the forefront of this current fuss about Chinese and Africans aren't picking up, because of the nature of the neo-colonial establishment that the white terrorists have engineered into place in Africa. Those rulers, office holders they are, state office holders they are, their main function is to kill Africans who rebel and resist them, and also to kill Africans who even think about and talk about rebelling against external European, Euro-American capitalist imperialist power. Those are who the African leadership currently kills with most enthusiasm. That's why Walter Rodney is dead. That's why the brother who was doing all those interesting things in the country of honest men, that is why Patrice Lumumba, that is why Kwame Nkrumah, who might have been dead of natural causes by now, life ended in a country that was not his own. Now, where are the continental Africans, or indeed the diasporan Africans, who are raising their voices or taking action against the military and economic penetration and increasing domination at the military level of the African continent by the American war machine called AFRICOM? Where is the protest against AFRICOM? This campaign against China comes from the White House and from the State Department in the United States of America. And it also comes, interestingly, at the start from where? From a place called Uganda. And Uganda is really the most enthusiastic of recipients of the business of military partnership between African governments and United States military forces, right? The French also have that with some African leaderships in the over on the other side of Africa. But so Uganda shouldn't have a leg to stand on in relation to raising a voice against China when they are fully complicit and at the head of the pack in relation to the AFRICOM business. And over on the other side of Africa, in Ghana, the Ghana president recently, secretly, and then he got his parliament to approve it, a compact with the United States of America that's ideologically, economically, militarily, just in terms of African self-respect, beyond the pale. There were demonstrations here about it. And then the base of the demonstration was supposed to be back in Ghana, died because the president convinced them that the relationship that he'd signed up to on a new basis between him and the Americans was no different from what's under the Geneva Convention. Turns out that even that is not true, and some interesting Ghanaians are currently contesting that. So, where is the continental African anger in relation to these matters? So, from Uganda, which both is the effective home or starting base for American military effective reoccupation of the African continent. They don't call it that. They call it alliances with governments and support for national military forces. But that is what it is. That's what AFRICOM is in Africa. So Uganda is also the headquarters of the Pan-African, the current manifestation of Pan-Africanism. Everybody should know that there was a Pan-African Congress in 1945 that lay behind, if you will, the movement of anti-colonialism that made such a spectacular pattern of movement in the post-war period, especially after the mid-1950s. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that there were no other Pan-African conferences or congresses apart from cultural things in Algeria, apart from two things that happened in 1958 in Ghana by Kwame Nkrumah. Everybody should know that the next Pan-African Congress happened in Tanzania in 1974, and that the next one was much later, happening in Uganda. And Uganda at that point became the headquarters of this alleged Pan-African entity. And it is out of that Pan-African entity that's not really concerned with Pan-Africanism, because any Pan-Africanism isn't about us finding a way to conduct the African revolution for our liberation, for our real independence, for our unification, for our reparations. Any Pan-Africanism that isn't engaged in that isn't really engaged in much. So that's the Pan-Africanism that's coming out of Uganda, and I'm not particularly disposed to following it, to enhancing it in some way, to praising it in any way, to allying myself with it in any form. So let us, using the means that we have, denounce the behavior of Chinese civilians and Chinese police forces, not all over China apparently, but in one province. Let's get the Chinese to call off their dogs. Let's remember that the Chinese have long had a feeling of superiority. There was a time when they probably still do, felt superior to everybody in the world. there was a time in the 18th century when the British sent an embassy, if you will, to the Chinese emperor. And the Chinese emperor said, "What have you come here for? What are you going to sell or trade with us that we do not have? Please go away. You have nothing to offer us." That's 2 centuries ago. And in the following century, those same people who had nothing to offer China, and the Chinese were right, had the military capacity to defeat China. So we Africans have a duty to learn from China, to recognize that China actually contributed to our liberation processes. Part of that was questionable because a lot of the time their motivation wasn't so much African liberation as their struggle with the Soviet Union. And some of the moves they made, including supporting UNITA at a time when UNITA was the enemy, a representative of Western, even South African forces in Angola and so on. Questions arise there. So the Chinese don't have a 100% record, but they do have a praiseworthy record in relation to supporting African national liberation struggles. So let us not make an enemy of the Chinese. Let us remember that there are all kinds of unfinished issues in business with other people closer to home, with Arabs, for example, with Arab Islam. Let's remember that. Let's remember that I can reach back here on my bookshelf and pick up a recent book pamphlet, which is about the extent to which white supremacy as Western capitalism, imperialism dominates Africa to an amazing extent economically. All of Africa's wealth, or far too much of it anyway, is controlled from right here in London. And Africans are not raising our voices, are not campaigning, are not organizing to end that. And so it's important that we say to the Chinese, don't mistreat our people in China. But we also have to be watching what the neocolonial, and fighting against, not just watching, what the neocolonial leadership is doing in the deals that they're making with China at the moment, in exactly what we have to make to look at the deals that they're making. It doesn't matter where you are. Guyana with Exxon and the oil. All of those West African countries now have oil that they've sold out for next to nothing and have allowed the Westerners to ruin their environment and so on in the process, or it's offshore, and the West is taking it away without anybody even counting or measuring what they're actually taking. So there are more important issues for us Africans to focus on than to expend our complete energy on the misdeeds of the Chinese, and they are real and they should stop in China now against Africans. One other thing that I've heard in the recent debate, people are blaming China and Russia for not vetoing the white terrorist assault on Libya. They are right that the Chinese and the Russians had the power to veto it in the Security Council and did not. Let us, I'm going to talk briefly about that, but let us remember how the African continent happened in relation to that. As the white terrorists were setting up to come to Africa to mash up an African country, African Arab country, to steal all of the gold. We know what they did when they invaded Haiti in 1914. We know that they took the gold from there and put it in Citibank in New York. What have they done with Libya's gold arising out of that 2011 action? Where is the African campaign in relation to that matter? Where is the African campaign in relation to what is happening to our oil, to our diamonds, to our gold, to our coltan, to our uranium? And it's an endless list, to our fish off the coast of Africa. So it is true that the Chinese and Russians did not veto, But the head of the AU or OAU at the time, who was the then South African state president, visited Libya. We don't know what he said to the Libyan leader, but he was there on behalf of the OAU. And he flew home again. And after he went there and said whatever idiotic words that he said to the Libyan leader, he went home, and the West continued as if the OAU had never moved. And indeed, they had not moved significantly. So let us remember that. The Chinese and the Russians, their case is that they didn't quite realize how wicked the West intended to be in relation to that assault on Libya. That when they said yes to a no-fly zone, which was a key military component of that destruction of Libya, when they said yes, or indeed did not veto the no-fly zone, they didn't quite realize what France and Obama and the United States of America, Britain were intending to do to Libya. And I can't blame them for not quite realizing, even though they should have done. But there has been another world development since, the issue of whether there should be a no-fly zone over Syria. And China and Russia, having discovered how the West uses no-fly zones, have said no to no-fly zones. And that's absolutely key to what they have not been able to do in Syria. And the Western objective there had been to destroy the state, make part of it officially available to Israel. That's actually happening anyway, because Trump has recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, I believe, and some other wicked Christian right-wing moves that he's made. So the intent had been on the part of the West, and Zionism and imperialism had been to break up that country into component parts. That hasn't happened. And the reason it didn't happen is because the Russians and the Chinese learned something about Western intentions in the instance of Libya. I want to end it there. Thanks for listening, as somebody once said, if you have been.
Okay. Thank you, Cecil, for that very informative speech. For those of you who have just joined, this is the PACM, the Pan-African Congress Movement Umoja Sessions, which will be taking place each Sunday. So now what I want, if people would like to ask questions, those of you who are have a YouTube account, there's 28 of you so far in the forum. You can please type your questions and we'll post them up on the screen and we can address those questions. In the meanwhile, I would like to introduce some of the other members of the PACM who are now in the back room. I'll put them in, and I'd also like them to make a comment as to the Africa-China relationship and from what Brother Cecil have said. First, I will bring into the chat room Elder Pepukayi. And Elder Pepukayi, if you could quickly just briefly introduce yourself, say who you are, and you could make a quick comment regarding the topic of today.
Thank you, Brother Taharkah. I'm glad to see my brother Cecil, one of the original founding member of the Pan-African Congress Movement. I would want to say that Brother Cecil is right to say it should be no hysterical response. We have to see ourselves as a people that have made ourselves impotent and therefore allow other people to mistreat us. But I want to look at another angle that Brother Cecil did not pay much attention to. When the European landed on us after conquest, slavery, and colonialism, it was gunboat and the Bible. And after some 5 centuries, the Chinese come in with money and a fake brotherhood. And it's sad that Chinese colonialism only less harsh, but just as wicked as European colonialism. And it is sad that we just sit back and behave like fools and allow it to happen. For example, if you borrow money, let's just say you borrow money to buy a house, take out a mortgage. There are terms, and the terms is if you fail to pay it back, repossession, lost your house, and all the money that you pay. We have a situation whereby the Chinese offer loans, and as if we're stark raving mad to accept the terms that they advance. And I've seen a situation whereby by the Taharkah, by the sister disappear from the street.
Okay.
I've seen a situation where you have the African Chinese summit, and you have the Chinese on one side of the table, one government, Communist Party, and you have 54 head of state on the other side of the table. The Chinese have the iPad or computers or what they have, and the Africans didn't even have a notebook, and they were just signing away. And you ask yourself the question, are they stark raving mad to just sign away under those kind of terms? There was a situation in Zambia where the Zambian couldn't manage the copper, and they called in the Chinese and they did a deal. The Chinese put no money on the table. The Chinese come to an arrangement. We'll take over the mines. We agree to pay you so much for it, and we'll pay you in 6 months, a year, whatever the case is. The Chinese get the mine operated, process the material, distribute it, collect the money, pay the Zambian in a very short space of time, and own the mine. What does that say about us? Are we stark raving mad to allow this one-sided exploitative arrangement? Because we're not just talking about what is recently manifesting in the mistreatment of Africans on Chinese soil. Look at how Chinese treat us in Africa itself. And we must understand, hold on just a moment, let me finish. We must remember as a people that before we start demand respect from others, we must first respect ourselves, and we show no self-respect.
Okay, thank you very much, Brother Pepukayi. Okay, Elder Bean is in the room now, so Brother Cecil is just finished, so I'd just like your thought on the, 3 minutes on the African-Chinese relation, and how do you see that going? And remember, I'm also posting up questions and comments from the audience. So I'll be posting them up from time to time so you can see what people are also thinking. Yes, Brother Bini, you can go ahead.
Don't have no relationship with no Chinese. We have never had no relationship, because how can you have relationship with people who just look at our situation and take advantage of it? Because our leaders are mad. The African leadership is mad to allow from Arabs to Chinese to European come and just dominate the continent. Every time I travel in the continent, I see the Chinese dominant, and they treat our people there, calling them niggers and so on, and even eating them. So what is our leaders doing apart from stocking up to another invasion of Africa? And this is Chinese colonialism now that's coming on, and the Chinese are making sure that they deal and dominate. The way that they're talking about relationship, there's no relationship between the Chinese and the African. That relationship doesn't exist. The Chinese have one thing: they have to feed. They have to feed their billions of Chinese, and then they just look at we as fool and come in and dominate and take what they want, because our leaders are stupid. We must put it down as our leaders are totally stupid, has no African consciousness, have no cultural value for their African self. So they are really, the white colonial boy them used to call it liquor picnic. These guys are worse than liquor picnic. They will sell out Africa. And I don't remember the situation in the copper mine in Zambia, where the Chinese man taking shotgun out because there was a protest by the miners and shoot one of the miners. And when the miners rush him and take him gun and shoot him back, China just comes straight away. Zambia, you better protect our citizens or else. Or else what? Because they already buy the leadership. China bought the leadership right across Africa. And we don't have leadership. That black so-called middle class is a major problem for African people. And until the African youths and the elder people there rise up and throw them out of power, we're not going to have any difference. There are 10 million Chinese in Africa. How many diaspora African in there? You can't even say 100,000. But there are 10 million. It's an invasion. They already, I think it's Djibouti, they got a military base there. America have a military base. The whole of Europe has got military base in this small little country. I think it's Djibouti. Now, I don't think we can have any relationship with any other race until we organize ourselves on a serious African mentality and an African way of life before we can talk about relationship. There's no relationship. We should see ourselves that we're gonna have a relationship with the Chinese. They're no different from the white man or the Arab man. They're in there in our continent for one purpose: feed their population. So we need to be very careful and do not make these people con us with their gift. They come in with gift, we'll build this. When you take the whole thing of them building in Addis, the AU headquarters, how many devices and bug them listening to you when you have this? We're stupid. We be stupid people. Yeah, you get Chinese turning around and calling us monkeys and so on and niggers and so. But we have to be standing up and say no, we're not having that. I pick up the Zimbabwean youth, not the Zimbabwean, the youth in Nigeria. Burn down them rat in the old factory. and them restaurants. And we have to take some stand and show them, say, we're not going to put up with their atrocities on African in China. Because lots of African people have gone to China and got beaten up or killed. And the African governments failed to come out and say, any African government says, stop messing with our people, you know, as get out of Africa, China. So we need to not welcome enemy in your house and accept that enemy is not gonna bite you. Yeah, and that's what they did for biting us. I didn't hear what Cecil said earlier because I took me time to get this thing set up. But surely we have to realize that time for us to make a stand has always been there, and we're too late in making a stand to protect our people.
Okay, so Brother Cecil, would you like to come back? You've seen some of the comments. I'd like to especially respond to some of the comments.
Yeah. I'm going to come back to the comments. I don't have any trouble with the remarks of either of my brothers, who I've known for almost too long, and worked with for decades.
You look at the virus, no get us.
So what?
Carry on. You look at him to get us the virus. All right, carry on.
So I hope that Brother Bini's last comment is not true, that we've not left it too late, but we're not doing very well, and I don't think it's an issue of stupidity. The people that lead us aren't stupid. What they are is that their heads, and this maybe it's another way of talking about stupidity, but their heads and their interests have been captured by the enemy. And when you have a leadership like that, they are going to sign up to and sign away everything and not see anything wrong with it. And when we challenge them, they're going to shoot us down, which is what they do. That's the nature. That's the nature of the setup that in the post-war period we Africans have allowed to be put in place in Africa. And if it's too late to defeat that, we're doomed, because it really is dreadful what is happening. And there's no way in which any of it is getting better. All of it is getting worse. So, right. No, yeah.
Well, I'm going to put some of these comments that's been coming in. So I'd like you to address, any of the speakers to address some of these comments. These are questions or comments being sent in by the viewers.
I can't see any yet. I see comments from you before we opened up, but no comments by anybody so far. Are they going down the bottom?
Yeah, they're at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes. All right.
At the bottom of the screen. Can you see them?
No.
Taharkah, can you read them to Brother Cecil?
Yes, that may make sense to us all, especially.
All right. All right.
Is one of them where the brother is talking about burning markets in Nigeria?
That's
may have
right.
taken lives. Huh?
Yeah.
That's on the screen right now.
Yeah. Okay. I'm seeing that. Brother Bini just mentioned that. I don't know, but clearly, when other peoples act in terrible ways towards us in their country, it's quite important that we show them that certain things are not acceptable. So I can't say that I disapprove of what has happened there. The other thing that I will say is that my brother Bini is incorrect, to say that there is no relationship. The relationship exists. is not beneficial to us. It's wholly beneficial to the Europeans and the Chinese, but a relationship exists, and they've put the machinery in place to sustain this relationship that works 100% for them and 0% for us. So it's an extraordinarily unequal relationship, but it's there.
Yeah, Cecil, I'm glad that I was in Dar es Salaam, 1970.
74.
No, I've been there before, because I went to
okay.
stay in the liberation camps of in Dar es Salaam in the 70s. Then my mom sent me off to Africa to see what was going on, because she said you can't be talking about African liberation and never been to the motherland. So she packed me after there with our friends from the PAC, and I stopped with them.
Yeah.
I remember
We need more
I got
mothers
arrested.
like that right now.
Hey?
We need more mothers like that right now.
You're right, because I got my ass arrested at the docks of Dar es Salaam, because I didn't know that you mustn't take a camera down at the docks when the ships come in for offload. But I'm glad I went there and I got to see. And I see the Chinese game. When I say there's no relation, Chinese game with African people, taking African people to assets. China was supporting UNETA.
Yes, I mentioned that.
Well, the CIA was backing UNETA, the American government, and these other white companies backing UNETA against MPLA. I see the kind of weapons they were sending to PAC and all the others. And there was bloody whole weapon. There wasn't even World War II weapon. And that tells you straight away they don't respect the whole thing of Africans controlling themselves. They were like little children to them. They flood their camps with Marxist Leninism and Chairman Mao, and nothing on Africa, nothing on African history. All it was there, and I saw that, and I'm glad I went there in Dar es Salaam at that time, where I could meet MPLA, Felimo, and all of them, and see the Chinese role. Nere was literally on his own. The African government wasn't even contributing to the liberation struggle materially. But these Chinese was taking advantage of that gap and giving them. But I must say that it was Gaddafi them never stopped paying their money to the liberation of Southern Africa. And that's what they I learned while being in Tanzania. You know, but we must look at that so-called relationship, that you're fighting an enemy, which them is party to, and then they send you all weapons they're no good to do the fight, you know. So that's it. And the other thing is, well, the guy, I think his name, I can't remember his name, Bison, that doctor who helped develop the weapon that will attack black people. That if you're white in a room and one of them walking with that weapon and release it, we all did, and the white walk out free. And the funny thing is, Russia and China was at that research relationship with the weapon that to kill blacks only. They were there. The Chinese were there. Why were they there? If they want a relationship with you, why are they joining these white terrorists to develop a weapon that only attacks black people because of the melanin and so on? So we have to be very, very open about how we see these Chinese, because they ship stuff into Africa which is inferior. We're just a consumer market that they tap into, and they sell us all their junk stuff what they make, which is not good, and it attacks the African market in terms of you know, brothers and sisters making something for themselves, manufacture. You kind of push them out of the thing, but because we have government who just accept the Chinese shipping this inferior product. Take a can opener. My brother ring me from Jamaica and tell me to bring a British standard can opener to Jamaica for him, because the Chinese one, after he used a few times, 3 times, he been up and it done. So I had to take him down, and I witnessed those things. I won't forget. And I know the Chinese in the district where I live in St. Andrew. There's a shop there. I didn't have no respect for black people until some black people decide, no, we're not going to put up with this and deal with them. And let them show respect for us. So I know there's no relationship with we and them. Because their relationship, they see us as inferior people to them. And that's why the Nigerian and all them Ugandans are getting held in China at the moment. But it's been going on before that. It's been going. It's not the first time they've been treating African people with turfing them out of their accommodation. So, but when they're 10 million there, I say send them back to China. Make China deal with them. China wants a landmass to dump its excesses population on, and they see Africa as a target, plus the raw material. And at the moment, America, China, and Europe, they all see us as a easy picking, and they will then start fighting each other for the continent again. They've done it before 2 times. That's what there's 2 world wars about. So they will do it again at the 3rd time. So we have to not be allowed to be used by anybody, whether Arabs or Chinese or European or any of our black middle class who are succumbing to collaborate with the destruction of their people. That's how I see it there, sir.
Okay, so at this point, I would really like us to explore a bit more in terms of the infrastructure, say in Africa, that the Chinese are putting up, because having been there recently, I saw for myself in terms of roads, in terms of other kind of infrastructure. So there's no doubting that China is definitely putting up infrastructure, which wasn't the case when the Western powers was there.
That's true.
Despite of that, how do we think we could forge any kind of better relation with China? Because definitely they've put up infrastructure. But to me, what's happening, the deals that's being made by the African government is basically too one-sided. You know, I mean, there has to be a lot more transparency in these deals. It's like China is, you know, seeing a lot of them are for sale and basically buying them, and they're signing these ridiculous deals. That's why I was pleased with Machiavelli Tanzania recently, who canceled the deal and say only a madman would sign this, and it has to be renegotiated. So I'd really like to talk a bit about more on that side. So who would like to take that up? And plus, please keep sending in your questions, and I'll put them up on screen so that we can discuss around that.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the leadership that we have in Africa, I repeat, it may be that the notion stupid applies, but we watch them being educated in a particular way, being cultivated in a certain way, being encouraged in a certain way, having people who were opposed to them killed off, right? This is what we've seen in the post-war period. And now what we have is a structure, some people call it neocolonialism, that really has to be defeated. And so for me, That's absolutely the crucial question. There's no easy answers unfortunately. That's why Walter Rodney's dead. You know,
Yeah, yeah.
you confront these states and they really do kill you. So the next stage of the African Revolution is what we have to be dealing with. Nothing short of that will do.
Yeah,
Yes.
I hear you say so because I travel to Africa quite a bit. Now with this crazy lockdown, we won't make the trip this year. But when you say about the infrastructure of Africa, they yes they're building railroads and they're building roads at a price.
Yes,
And I see some of the roads that they're building, and somebody who's in the construction know that's rubbish. The roads they're made so that they come back and come fixing just like the white guy would do. And when they build a hospital or school, the whole of the writings on it is Chinese, and even some of the shape is Chinese. So
yes,
cultural imperialism is actually at work there.
yes,
And when they do, they bring their labor force,
yes,
and that's what I'm saying. How can you bring labor force? Your people unemployed, and you're letting a country bring in all these labor force into from China to build your roads and build the school. What about your people? So that's why I made the comment. They got to be stupid, as Pepukayi said. They got to be mad leadership that are behaving like that. Wait a bit, Nyla. Wait a bit. So we it's the mindset of our people in Africa. There has to be a change mindset. When I got to DRC and I was in the diamond and gold market, and I see a whole of Chinese with their bodyguards and stuff, and I stopped because I see this Chinese guy um, negotiate with an African brother to fairly big enough size diamond, which I know by the time you cut and so you'll make probably 10, 20,000 pounds on that. So I was trying to get the brother attention who was selling it. So anyway, the Chinese guy gave him the money. And I was rapping and I said, guy, well, so Chinese guy walk off with his little coconut bodyguards and stuff. And you know, I said, how much did that guy fully give you? Because I can't believe this is 65 US dollars. He says, yes. I said, you know what? You, when he goes and sell that back, he's making at least 20,000 pounds sterling. So therefore, you've been robbed, right? And a lot of you have been robbed by these Chinese coming in. But as talking to him after him say, you know, my brother, I know what you're saying, but you know what happened? I got my children to feed. I'm hungry. I have to have some money. And that's why he beat me down to that $65. But the government there, they just allow them people to walk in your country and then go exploit your own people. They go in and do illegal mining in Ghana. And as you say, Cecil, you're right on this. When they speak out against these African governments because they're doing a nasty job, they want to execute you with them dead squad. The thing is, we need to have, we on the diaspora, we need to get the people to have a different mindset by feeding the information to them. We have to feed the information to them and help them to change mindset. That's why it's important for us to feed information to the people of Africa. This year when I went to Berenge, I went to the university and talked to them, and it was amazed. The faculty of the university, at every faculty, where there is science and engineer, whether it's and European history and blah blah blah, and Chinese history, Arab history, but then I'm not African history. And I was telling them about Garvey. They were shocked, and I said, "A brethren mine, Cecil help out to, in Jamaica with the Garvey house to help provide them with information. They don't have the information. So the mindset has to be worked on in Africa to change that mindset, to have a different mindset. I hope this corona can help us to have more influence on our brothers and sisters on the continent. Because I know when we go back in, I know they will be much more eager to hear our opinion and stuff like that. And that visit by Nyeri's son that came over to UK and meet with us was a very important thing because it helped to make that links with people in Africa. So we need that link, to link up constantly, you know. Educating our people is a major one. They're way behind. We can remember when we started in the 60s. They're way behind on that. So we need to help change their mindset.
Okay. I know there's a lot of noise in the background somewhere.
Wait a bit. My granddaughter got this cheese. Let me go get it. Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
So I'd like us to address point or question that's been raised. I mean, there's one here is who is policing Chinese criminals in Africa by recent mobile phones factory. I think it was Uganda or Kenya.
Where's the noise coming from?
Tell them what's mute.
It could be also you got the phone.
Yeah, I've muted that mic because that's where it was coming from. Yeah, there's a question up on the screen that I would like.
Yes. I don't know what the answer to that is. It asks who is policing or responsible for policing Chinese cyber criminals in Africa. Probably nobody. The African governmental infrastructure, because all of these little governments are all strapped for cash and dishonest and so on. Almost everything, all security issues are in the hands of either Israel or the United States or somebody like that. And if there comes to be an issue with the Chinese, it'd be on the same level, and the Chinese will be exploiting the space for their own benefit.
Okay. Any other comments, Brother Pepukayi?
No, the point I wanted was to raise was the point you said that in your recent trip to Africa, you saw the infrastructure being put up by the Chinese. Now let's go back to the example of the Tanzanian government.
Mm-hmm.
When they look at a previous arranged agreement with the previous administration, they said, no, we can't go with this. And they moved straight away to renegotiate it with the Chinese. They had to cancel it because the Chinese would not budge an inch. What does that tell you?
All right then, but that tells me that either the Africans are really rubbish negotiators or they are very corrupt. That's what that's telling me. Because if I'm negotiating with somebody, I'm going to try and strike the best deal for me.
Right.
It's up to you now to argue for your side and argue for your side. So it's obviously the Chinese are going there and they're putting forward proposals that's in their favor, and they're not being challenged enough, and Africans are accepting deals which is detrimental to themselves.
Precisely.
Well, can I just say? Can I just say? Right, we have long existed in a framework where since certainly the late 70s, the outside world has presented us with agreements that our leadership, including some bright youngish people, don't have any machinery to deal with. All of that framework within which Jamaican dairy industry disappeared, in which Ghanaian rice industry disappeared, in which fishing off West Africa got sold out to European fishing companies and so on. All of that's happening before our very eyes. All of those land deals where millions of hectares are being leased for next to nothing to Arabs and Chinese and Pakistanis and Indians and so on. That is how things are. And it's not just the Chinese, or it would be strange if the Chinese weren't doing it, because that is what they face. Take Guyana in the Caribbean. Leave aside Trinidad. Trinidad has oil agreements that were entered into a long time ago. They've never known how much oil is taken out of there. Guyana, oil has been discovered there. They didn't know it was there from a long time, but they're just ready to exploit it. At the moment when they're ready to exploit it, they go and talk to a government. Is the same. The government is a strange entity. It's the same people who killed Rodney in a national alliance with the people who were in Rodney's party. and if they had read Rodney, they would have known that you can't sign that kind of deal for oil or anything else with these people. But they've signed up. They've signed up to it, and it's happening throughout global Africa. So we got to take a step back and understand how the enemy has structured the African world to suit them and not us, how they put in place inside of Africa people who either don't know their arse from their elbows, or if they do, the part of their arse that they know is the part from which they benefit at the expense of the African people. And that is how the African world is now organized. And if we can't change that, we Africans are doomed, because all of the elements of it operate against the mass of the African people, not in the interest of Africans. That is how the world is structured.
That's a good point. You said if we can't change that, so what would be your advice?
Say again.
What would be your advice in changing, in hoping to change the situation that Africa finds itself in? How do you think it can best go about that?
I don't have any easy answers, and any answers that I had that I think would work, I wouldn't be giving them on air, because I just said that at the point at which you come up with real answers, they come and kill you. So we Africans have got to organize for the next stage of our development, secretly, clandestinely, and when we make our moves, they can't be advertised in air.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, the task that we have, the primary task, is to make sure that African people, and I don't mean just in Africa, Africans globally, understand the nature of the world, that even though we fought and won against enslavement, even though we fought and won against colonialism, the structures that dominated and murdered our parents are still the ones that are there. And the fact that they have people who look like you, all of us here, running things, doesn't stop them and their helpers being the enemy. So that's the task. So people got to understand that when the white man was there directly, mobilizing the anti-colonial struggle was easy. Now that the white man is one removed, and he presents through people who look like you and me, African people are confused about it, and that's the barrier that we've got to get through.
That's right, Professor. That confusion of replacing the white fascist boy them
Yes,
and put a black face there. We it take us a while, or most of our people, to understand that these people are enemy of African people. Just like Obama, when they
yes,
say about Obama, Ghana, yes we can, yeah, you all got to get together. Obama wasn't working for black people, he was working for white people. And he was clear about, and he confused the African mind and the continent, thinking, well, here we got a United States president, the biggest superpower with all its weaponry and so on, came into the continent. They thought they were going to get something. They never get jack. I think that kind of wake them up a bit. That's why I said this corona thing is going to force Africans to trade with each other more, to manufacture their own thing, to sort out the health service, because the health service is just ridiculous in Africa. Every time a leader gets sick, he have to take a jet plane. And why I say this corona thing come at a time with help us, because any of those leaders sick today, they can't leave Africa. They
well,
can't
I'm
just
not.
jump.
Is that true though? Flights are still taking place, but I
Yeah,
mean,
but a lot of them don't move.
I think that the corona thing is a big confusion. Somebody came on, stay on a radio program, and a brother came on and said it represents a weapon of mass destruction. It seems to me that represents a weapon of mass confusion. I don't understand why all of Africa is closed down, right? I saw some figures for flights coming out of China and flights coming out of Wuhan. Those flights weren't going to Africa, they weren't going to the Caribbean, and that's why the victims, apart from the Chinese who got it under control, the victims are in Italy and Spain and England and the United States of America. That's where the flights to, and not just China, from Wuhan, hundreds of flights out of there, Chinese and others back and forth. And that's where the infection has come from, and that's why it's here rather than in Africa. They made all this fuss about the need to close down African economies. It's true that if the virus hit in Africa, enough people would die, but no big set of people are going to contract it there. There weren't any flights carrying infected people into Africa. So, and I don't really know how the COVID-19 thing is going to change the world in our interests. I can't see that.
Bye now. Yeah.
Before anybody else come in, I've been advised that you need to mute those of us who are not speaking.
So when you're not speaking, if
Just mute it.
Okay, I see. Yeah, I'm happy to do that.
Also, when I've been in there to take care of his section,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah,
where
it's
the
more
number is coming from.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a lot better now. It's coming from yeah. Okay. Okay. Just to say to the listeners, keep sending in your questions and comments. Yeah, because we like to see your question and comments so we can talk around them or present them to the speakers. So there's another point that you said about not a lot of flights went to Africa. that wasn't what I heard, because I heard this. There's over 10 million Chinese in Africa. Yeah. When the virus struck, it was Chinese New Year, which is traditional for a lot of Chinese to go back to China and go back to where they're from, which I think took place. It took place to a large extent. And I know a lot of planes were coming into Africa for the China, because even people were protesting and saying, why are all these planes coming in and they're not being properly tested? So a lot of planes did come in. So I'm of the school of thought that the has mutated since it's left Wuhan. And it seems like Europe have got the worst of the strain of the virus. I'm not saying Africa, because we know it's there, but it don't seem to be creating the same kind of havoc and devastation as it is in Europe. That's my information anyway. That's what I've heard in terms of the virus. But I would really like to keep this on track about the African-Chinese relation more and try not to drift too much. Looking to the future now, how can we see this relation developing, or can we see it collapsing? You know, what do people think going forward would be the relation between China and Africa? Do you think it's something that can be strengthened? Do you think it's something that can be sorted out? Do you think it's something where Africa can get its act together more? And so when it do negotiate with powers such as China or United States and so forth, they can talk more from a position of strength. I know what Brother Cecil have said, like in the past, especially looking at France and their attitude. If you oppose them, they would have assassinated the leaders, hence Thomas Sankara, hence many other leaders that they forcibly overthrew for opposing their rule. But what encourages me, I've been following quite a few of the youths on the ground in Africa, because a lot of them now have YouTube channel, and I'm seeing a different mentality completely. A totally different mentality is coming up, where they're saying enough's enough and we are now going to make a stand. And where our leaders try and sell us down the river, we're not going to stand for that. So to me, there's some kind of hope for the future in the younger generations coming up. So that's what I'd like to explore now. Going forward, the relationship with China, how do people see it? At the moment, so
two things. One is just briefly on the flights. Clearly, some flights did go to the continent of Africa, and you're right about when the toing and froing of Chinese was mainly happening. So on that, you're probably closer to being correct than I am. But even if that's true, Africa has not been a massive recipient of the COVID-19 thing. Otherwise, people would be dying in larger numbers than there are there. The South African figures look interesting and worrying, but I didn't look that up properly enough, so I'll just leave it to one side. But what's happening there, just as what happened with HIV in South and Southern Africa, there's probably something to worry about there. But we may be talking about that sometime soon, Brother Pepukayi, and then we can exchange views on that. With regard to China and Africa, I do say, and this is repetition, that there is a relationship. It's a relationship that's almost 100% in China's or in the white people's favor, and close to 0% in African favor. And it's even though it's a small part of China's economy, it's still a massive thing. So I was looking at some figures. The Chinese trade with Africa is more than 200 billion per annum, and the investment, so-called investment, and the great thing about Rodney's work is that he told us, if we didn't know before, that there's nothing benevolent about foreign direct investment. So if there's nothing benevolent about Western direct investment into Africa, there's not going to be anything benevolent about it where China is concerned. And if the African leadership doesn't understand that, they'll sign deals that are not in the interest of Africa. So even though the relationship is a small percentage of the total overall of China, which is massive. China is the second largest economy in the world now. So we're talking trillions. But in relation to Africa, it's still big. And we can't just imagine that because we don't like it, it's going to go away. So our leadership, even if the neocolonials are in place, have to just handle it more intelligently. You cannot go and sit down with people and come out with agreements like the one that Brother Bini was talking about, like the one that the Guyanese government has just signed up to with Exxon for oil off the coast of Guyana and so on. Those deals are, without exception, disgracefully unbalanced. So, and my final point is that even in the darkest time, our people have found ways to resist successfully. I remember some white journalists in maybe 1970 coming through the UK and asking people, including me, what I thought was going to happen in South Africa. And I couldn't see any way out and said so. Less than 20 years later, the armed struggle had developed. And in the middle of the 90s, white power, after a fashion, was defeated. Nelson, of course, only ever wanted the vote for black people and never wanted much more than that. And so his betrayal wasn't just because he was in prison or just because of the agreement that he signed up to. He never wanted the revolution. What he wanted was votes for black people. So it's good. It's good that you're telling us, brother Taharkah, that the young people are ready to stand up, because we need the young people to stand up.
Okay. Anybody else want to comment? Brother Pepukayi?
Saying that Brother Bini need to take care of background noise.
Okay, just come through. I've muted the mic. Come on. Hello?
Yeah, as Brother Cecil said, the challenge facing us as global African is no easy task, because the leadership that we have in Africa, the majority of it is colonial. There's very few progressive government in Africa. The Tanzania is the first one that come to mind, and I'm not sure if I could point to one more other country that is taking a positive step. Now, when you talk about the young people in Africa, yes, there's an awareness, but where's the organization behind it? There's a structure that is, and we as global Africans have to see as the last opportunity for us to come up with a plan that is about rescue and liberation and independence for people.
Okay.
On is saying that clearly the Chinese can't be trusted to supply good technology. the Europeans can't be trusted to supply good technology either. And when they supply the bad technology, when I was living in Jamaica, an Irish company, I forget what they were called, were down there, and they were passing themselves off as benevolent, and all they had was their hands were almost directly in the people's pocket, as you know, everybody was saying, I'm, you know, somebody would text you to say, text me someone so I can so I can call you. And they were making millions upon millions upon millions upon millions, and that's just on the ordinary cell phone. So what they're doing more generally is that, you know, and they call this, they count all of that stuff in the growth economy, and they're just misleading people and ripping off people. And that happens in every field of economic endeavor.
Okay. Okay, so I'd like to put the point then. So from what I'm hearing, do you think there have been an overreaction to what has recently happened in China? If we put it in a historical perspective, what has happened to Africa before, what has been unleashed in Africa before by others, now the Chinese are you can say, the main movers in Africa. Do you think there has been an overreaction in terms of what's recently happened compared to what has gone previously?
Okay. I do not believe that the Chinese are the main enemy in Africa, right? I believe that the West and white power and the Arabs are a much more important enemy of Africans than the Chinese. I think that the fuss that has been made about their mistreatment of Africans is a good thing. Even though I don't like the idea of burning down individual people's stores in Africa, to get the idea across to the Chinese that they must respect Africans is an important thing to communicate to them, and all of the means should be mobilized. So I see that some of the neo-colonial governments are calling their ambassadors in, and the Chinese ambassadors and governments are beginning to make all the right noises. So they must get their people to behave towards us. So this upsurge, I don't think there's an overreaction. The crucial thing is that we remember that the big controllers of the African economy is not the Chinese. It's actually the old imperialist structures from England and Belgium and France and Germany and the United States of America. It's them who own the stuff.
Yeah, well, I'd agree with you there, Cecil, in some way. The Chinese is not really controlled. Take, for instance, France. They got 14 colonies, 15 or whatever. And all those countries that France still control, because they say they give them independence, but they have to sign an agreement to bank their money in France.
Yes.
And when they want the money, they have to pay a percentage to get their own money out.
Yes.
Now, yes, the Western criminals, multinational, have got Africa on lockdown. The Chinese are coming up fast behind them in dominating the continent and in what it's doing. That's why when you travel into Africa, you see them building roads, hospitals and stuff, because the Chinese are very smart in using the art of warfare, their philosophy of violence, military violence against other people or even themselves. And they're doing exactly that, but the Africans can't see it. That they can't see that they've been woodwinked all the way, and when China ready, it just will make its move. China is not building up a great army and navy, air force for fun. They know they need that in if they're gonna dominate any part of the world that they want to control. And the biggest prize really today in the world is to who control Africa. I don't think the African government realize, unless they study Chinese history and philosophy and see what China, how they used to operate in China, and still today they still do the same thing. So what we need to do is whether we can pass that kind of mindset on our African people to resist this kind of new form of colonialism, because this is this is serious colonialism. The Chinese ain't joke when they start getting places like South Africa to teach Mandarin in the school because they have stupid leader, instead of they teaching our children to speak all the different language in Africa. It's only day South Africa come up with a policy to teach all the children the different clans language in the school. And they even admit that since they've been doing that, the children no longer fighting each other. They start developing an African identity. We really have to look at how we get the young people to understand that they need to go for African revolution, cultural revolution, to change the mindset in the continent. Because the leaders are, well, I can't say nothing more but that they're damn stupid. They need one of them old people saying they want a box past the years old, because when I said I went to Berry again, Gambia, and I went to go and say I want to go beach. I go to the beach, and not far from that beach, they build a massive Chinese fish processing. I mean, this water. I say, what is all this slime and green stuff I come from, and come from me? So I say, now I come out to this water. We ask the people and say the Chinese throw the guts and head in the water, and it turned the water nasty. And there you are, your government just who no sense, let them build something, and then the waste from the fish, for them find ways of dealing with it. Chinese just dump it in the sea, which is I see it even start developing a rash after going in the sea. Now we have to move to another beach where the Chinese, that was just, the stuff wasn't coming back at the people. So we see it, and I see it in the Congo as well, how they build, and the roads, they just have their workers there, and I think it was Kabila just said, no, this can't happen no more. You have to make African workers work on the new highways, because Congo really don't have roads, it's dirt tracks. So now they're pulling them down. The thing is, it's how we're going to try and influence those African leaders who still in power there and who are still resisting the call of the people for change. So we get those people to realize change can only come when the people decide, look, these people and their neo-colonialism behavior, we have to get rid of them. When the people start getting rid of them, because the people are in the bigger mass, we are a small number, the diaspora. Once the people start take them on, that's it. We can change the views.
Okay, so this is the last 5 minutes before we wrap up. So I'd like to, there's a question here asking, is there anything the diaspora can do to support the youths who are challenging Chinese domination? That's one point I would like you to just give a view on. And the other view was just what was touched on by Bini recently, is that surely part of the way forward is that when negotiation and when governments enter into negotiations, especially with the Chinese, there's a thing that there's a lot of unemployed people in Africa. Africa needs workers. So why are we negotiating deal when the Chinese are bringing in their
Their
own?
work.
And we know a lot of those workers are convicts, are prisoners. You know, that's an open
Back
secret that
home.
they've been brought in that way. So surely part of the way forward, yes, if you have to negotiate a deal, you make sure jobs are provided for African people. If you're building a road, that can employ thousands of people. And the majority of the jobs should go to African people. When Nissan and Toyota build factories in this country, how many workers from Japan did you see come over to man those factories? You know, it's manned by people in this country. So surely that's a solution. But I'd just like a quick view on everybody in the last 5 minutes, especially to deal with the youths, because the youths are very active at the moment. They're the ones we're seeing on the streets. They're the ones we're seeing actually going out and openly challenging the Chinese because of what went on with Africans in China recently. So what support do you think, he's asking, what support do you think we in the diaspora could lend to that movement?
I think that the diaspora African appeal to all our brothers and sisters. We're not just talking about the China, but everybody else who see Africa as a breadbasket. We should encourage the youth to lead that campaign. We should encourage them. I mean, we should help to educate them using the same machine, the internet, and all this. So instead of young people using it and showing foolishness and showing some, weird things on it, but to put out an African-centered program for the youths to engage them, because I've met in Uganda with African people, and they're still there. I've set up a Pan-African group, and they meet every Friday, and they can talk, them can influence them with many African youths. We can influence them by providing the information to them, because they're looking for information. When I'm in the Congo in the evening, all them load of youths around me, I will talk to them and try and do a kind of workshop to educate them about the reality of what we're facing as African people. So we can do something to help the youths in Africa. We just have to, some of us love the internet so much. If we just get the internet stuff and send them proper information, things like John Henry Clark, Amos Wilson, and so much, so they can access it and have their little workshop and discuss those things. That John Henry Clark, Dr. Ben, the whole of them, we can feed them. We've got the problem. We got the information is to get it out there in Africa, and once it's out there, I will tell anybody, when you start talking to the youth in the street there, they're like sponge. They want to know everything about what we have gone through, the history that we have. They want to know. You can have a temple, and you go to the temple and there's 5,000 people. The majority they are youth, and all they want to do is make the diaspora delegation speak like what go with me. They want them to speak, to tell them things. So we can make an impact in Africa, and that's something we must do. Okay.
So
just following from Brother Bini and Brother Cecil, we must begin to build and sustain an African global conscious raising movement. Has to be global, because it's not just about how Chinese or other people behave towards us. Let us say the Chinese were nice, smile, and they wasn't doing the behavior that they were doing, and they were still moving to colonize Africa. we have to open our eyes clearly to see how we promote our interests, how we defend our interests, and the leadership. We must have no illusion that we're gonna change their way of doing business because some of them profit. They've been bought off with money, whatever. So from the grassroots, we have to have a rising from the grassroots, conscious raising. And once the people begin to see clearly what is happening, that will determine the action that we take. But we must begin to build a global conscious raising movement. And we have to understand who the Chinese people are. I was born and raised in Jamaica. And the relationship we had with Chinese is that they were behind one side of the counter and was on the other side of the counter. We hand over the money, they hand over the goods. They didn't talk to us. They had no relation with us. They were behind the fence. We didn't see them. They had no relationship with us. They were cold and distant. So we have to understand the nature of the Chinese people. And how stupid can it be that you allow them to come in because of a loan, because of infrastructure? Are they going back? They're not going back. They stayed. And as Brother Bini said, Africa is the land for the surplus population. I understand that the population of China is what? Some 2 billion. That's a lot.
Okay. So finally, Cecil, I'll leave the last word to you, seeing as you was the principal speaker today. So again, addressing this question in terms of the youths, because to me, obviously they have taken to the street in what they've seen happen to their brothers and sisters in China, and they're venting their anger. But how do you best think that can be channeled into a positive direction? Yeah, Brother Cecil?
I think it's good that the youths are rising up, but the enemy and target has to be broader than Chinese and Chinese businesses. It has to be against all of the neocolonial structures, including the ones who look like us who run the places. Now, that resistance is bound to happen because it comes out of the real conditions that our people are facing in all of those territories, be it Congo or Jamaica or wherever. The point about information, radical information, the kind of information that Walter Rodney discovered the value of passing on to youths and to people on the ghetto bank or the gully banks in the equivalent of that, wherever they're located, matters. But I think that Brother Pepukai's point about the international level of it, because the way things currently stand, you have 56 struggles, or as many places as there are, as many countries as there are. You have a little struggle going on, each of which may be at various heights, various levels, but each of which is being defeated because there is no global African coordination, no global coordination movement. That's what China provided to China. And in the absence of something like that in our part of the world, it's very difficult to pull the resistance together with a view to overthrowing this big enemy. And that's what we have to think through and find a practice that can achieve that outcome.
Okay. Well, we're drawing to a close now. But thank everybody for taking part in this very interesting debate today. And I'd also like to thank those who have entered the our forum and have sent in questions. And I know for the many who are watching us on YouTube live. So these would be regular meetings taking place by the African Congress Movement each Sunday at 6 o'clock. So please get ready. And again, next day we'll be having another very, very interesting decision. And I'd just like to end by saying, today we're talking about Chinese-African relation. Remember, I think it was Malcolm used to come up with a famous phrase that you haven't got a Chinaman's chance. At one time in history, as Brother Cecil touched on, they were kicked about, they were abused and misused, but they got their act together. They went away, got their act together, and now they're a mighty force in the world. Okay, it's a shame sometimes that we are at the other end of it, but we can do a lot but to learn a lot from them. How was it that they got their act together? How was it that they now find themselves as the second largest economy in the world? And they can basically, every country, even America now is frightened of them. Because during this, what's happening now with the coronavirus, and as you can see, the Western economies are basically shut down. Now they're panicking that China is going around buying up their businesses wholesale. There's emergency laws being passed right now to stop that. So from one point of being an outcast and being kicked about to now a true world power. Yes, we can study them and we can learn from them what processes they used in order to achieve that. But at the same time, we should not underestimate our power as African people, because the most feared people on the planet, I would say, is us. Every part of the world is looking at Africa. China, India, places like that, because of the huge population, and they need some way for the overflow. And the obvious place is Africa. The Western countries, especially countries like France, without Africa, France would be a third-rate country. The 500 billion that was channeled into France by the Francophone states, who are now, every year, who are now trying to make some kind of stance and saying this cannot continue. We know France just won't sit back quietly and allow them to pull all that money. The eco currency that they was trying to put forward, we have seen that France has basically sabotaged that. They have tried to take it over. But we should not undermine our strength, and we just have to look at our history to see what we are capable of. And it's because the rest of the world know what we are capable of. That's why we are under such scrutiny. And because, just to end, what I find incredible, everybody agreed that this virus started in China. Everything pointed to China, and yet they managed to flick the script and somehow come around to start blaming Africans for the spread of this virus. So exactly the same situation with the AIDS virus. Everybody knows that came out of America, but they was able to, again, turn the script so that Africa got blamed for it. So we know, I think it was John Henry Clark says, we have no friends. And the sooner we realize that, the better. Because many people would have run from the Western colonization and found solace with Russia and found solace with China, only to find out they're not your friends. So instead of us running, trying to find, let us look inwards. Let us do what, I would say, let us do what China did. And let us re-emerge whenever we are ready as the force that we are.